Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to talk about some of the most infamous kidnappings in U.S. history, and I'm going to look at a few movies and how this might have some influence on the JonBenet Ramsey case. So as we know, in the JonBenet Ramsey case, I would say most people think that someone in the family did it. But there's that small chance it could be an intruder, so I thought by looking at some of the history of kidnappings in movies at that time, we can maybe learn some new things about this. So let's go into some of the biggest kidnappings in U.S. history. So the biggest kidnapping in U.S. history was the Chowchilla kidnapping. In this case, Frederick Woods and brothers James and Richard Schoenfield abducted 26 children ages 5 to 14. The kids were leaving a summer trip at a swimming pool, and these guys blocked the bus with a white van. They came in with guns, and then they ended up driving the bus several miles away to hide the bus, and then that's where they had another van. And so they got all the kids and the bus driver into these two white vans, and they drove up towards San Francisco area. And so they didn't want them to know exactly where they were going, so they drove like all night and got there in the morning. They lowered the kids into this tractor trailer, which they already put in some mattresses and water and some food. There was a little pipe where there was some air coming in, but no doubt it's mid-July, so it'd be super hot. They closed the top hatch and put these really heavy batteries and things on top so that they couldn't escape. And then they left and they went to go call the police to ask for a $5 million ransom. But the thing is that all of the kids in that town, their parents were all calling the police, so they couldn't even get through. And so they passed out for a few hours and went to try later, and they already saw on the news that the kids had escaped. They had piled up the mattresses and were able to push up the top latch, and they escaped. These three guys who were in their lower 20s, I think they were like 21, 22, and 24, would end up spending almost their entire lives in jail. Like the two brothers got out when they were in like their mid-50s and early 60s, and the ringleader, Frederick Woods, just got out in 2022 at 70 years old. So I guess these guys actually wanted this money because they wanted to restore like this old Victorian home on San Francisco Bay, which is so weird because that to me seems like kind of like a middle-aged like couple's dream. So why these guys wanted the money to be able to do this is crazy. It was like $60,000 they needed, and they were already in debt. And so they did get to go to the big house, but not exactly the house they wanted. And the worst part is that they were rich kids too. So they would have eventually had a bunch of money inherited to them. And so they got that when they were, 60s or 70s. So anyway, crazy case. Luckily all the kids got out without being hurt. Of course, some personal, mental trauma and different things, but at least everyone was safe. The next case is Frank Sinatra Jr. Obviously, most of us should know of Frank Sinatra, one of the most legendary singers in U.S. history. His 19-year-old son was also a performer, and he was singing in Lake Tahoe and went back to his hotel, and this guy, Barry Keenan, who was just 23, him and his friend went up to the door. They said they were delivering room service or something like this. They went in with guns. There was a few people there, and they tied up a couple of the guys, and they took Frank Sinatra Jr. And they ended up driving all the way back to LA. So of course, the police and everyone knew very quickly. So they had roadblocks at the border to like Nevada and other states, and roadblocks in general. And Frank Sinatra Jr. was acting cool through the whole thing. He wasn't resisting. They got stopped once, and Barry talked to the cop, and Frank Sinatra was just going along with it. And so they got him to their house somewhere, I think, near LA. And then they also wanted some help from an older guy to help them. So they had his mom's boyfriend basically came, who's like a middle-aged guy who had been in the military and stuff, and kind of more of the tough guy they wanted to make the phone call. And so they had called someone and made the ransom, which was $240,000. And Frank Sinatra even said, like, I'll give you $1 million, just give me my kid back. And they didn't even want the million, they just wanted the $240,000. And so they did the pickup, and they let go of Frank Sinatra somewhere on the roadside. He luckily got back safely. And they were all excited, they had all this money. And it was actually the older guy who was on his way to New Orleans and stopped and mentioned to his brother what he did. His brother actually called and told the police. And so they all got busted and got like 75 years to life. But I guess anytime you get life in California, or like the situation, you could plead insanity. And they did, and then it was lowered to like maybe 35 years. And in the end, they only got 3.5 to 4.5 years. So if I think that the laws today in California are crazy, like, I guess it's been like that for a while. The first known kidnapping in U.S. history was of Charlie Ross on July 1st, 1874. So you might have heard the phrase, I think everyone has, don't take candy from a stranger. I'm not sure if that came exactly from this case or people have just always said that, but that's what happened here. These two guys who I assume are 30s or 40s named Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas had lured Charlie, who's 4 years old, and his brother Walter, who was 6, into their carriage to go buy some candy and fireworks. And so they went over across to the other side of town in Philadelphia, and they gave Walter some money to go inside to get something, and they basically took off and left Walter, and they had left with Charlie. And so within a day or two, the family gets a letter, which was like super, super bad English, like super hard to even be able to comprehend. But they're basically asking for $20,000 and to have it at this select time and we'll meet, etc. Initially, the father was actually reluctant to pay them. After he had seen his wife was, getting so upset, he said, let's try to go ahead and pay them. And it wasn't really easy because although they owned a dry goods store and they had a mansion, they had just got hit by like a Great Depression like earlier that year or so, and they lost almost everything they had. So they finally were trying to agree to do a switch for the kid for the money. And this took months and months. Like there was 23 letters that had come from the kidnappers and places they were supposed to meet, and things didn't work out. And finally, about 6 months later in December, those two guys were actually in New York City and they were broke. And so they went to a wealthy neighborhood. And in this area, a lot of people had like summer homes there, but they weren't there in winter. And it was December, so they broke into a house, and the neighbor next door was the guy's brother. And so it tripped the alarm. And so, they knew that there was someone next door, and they thought, well, maybe the wind just blew the door open or something like that. And the one guy had looked out and seen there was someone with a candle inside walking through. It was obviously in the evening. And so he gathered up not just his son, but a couple other guys and some guns. And they went to the back in the front door and waited for them to come out. They ended up coming out from the cellar doors, and there was some shots exchanged. And actually, Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas got the first shots, but luckily missed them. The other guys returned fire, and the one guy was killed instantly. But Joe Douglas was fatally wounded, but he was still alive for about an hour and 15 minutes. And it was during that time that he admitted he committed the kidnapping of Charlie Ross. And then later, the brother, Walter, actually went to go see their deceased bodies in the morgue, and he verified that it was them. And then also, there was possibly an ex-cop that was involved in some way. Not with the kidnapping, but with something in general. And the sad part is that Joe Douglas had mentioned that the boy was okay and that he would be returned in a few days. And the boy was never found. So we have no idea in that 6 months what happened. Obviously, these two guys probably aren't the best parental figures. I don't know if they left them with a couple women or something, but he probably died somewhere along the way. So the next case is of John Paul Getty III. So this is an American family, but he had been living in Rome because his father was there running their petroleum business. This guy's grandfather, Jean Paul Getty Sr., was like one of the richest oil barons in America, like one of the richest people in the world. And so they knew this kid was hanging out in Rome and partying and was in some commercials and even like, I think, some nude photos and things. And so he was in a plaza in Rome one night with some girl he met, and the mafia came in and kidnapped him and drove him down to South Italy somewhere. and they asked for $17 million. And his grandfather was known to be super stingy. Like, he had this enormous mansion, but he even had like a payphone in his home because he didn't want people to make like calls on his phone. So they had to pay to use a phone in his house, even though he's like a billionaire. And so he actually refused to pay the mafia the $17 million. He said, if I give you money, I have 13 other grandchildren who might get kidnapped, so I don't want to encourage this. So he's like, yeah, I'm not going to do anything. So he was kidnapped in mid-July, and by November, nothing had happened. And his father, someone got a package in the mail, and it was of John Paul Getty's right ear and some hair. And so that kind of freaked people out a bit, obviously. And then they also lowered the amount of money they wanted from $17 million to $3.2 million. And so the old man, the grandfather, said, I'll pay $2.2 million because I could get a tax write-off, but someone else has to come up with the other $1 million. And so the son, the grandson, basically had to ask his dad for the $1 million, but he had to pay him back with 4% interest. Pretty bizarre family. So anyway, they finally did do the delivery. It was obviously like a government agent guy had gone to deliver the money, and there were some people nearby getting photos and tracking them. At least he was safe, besides the fact that he lost his ear and he was almost a half a year in captivity, moving to different parts of the country so that he wouldn't get found. And eventually they did end up arresting about 9 people, but only 2 of them were sentenced to jail. Of course, the bigwigs in the mafia never got in trouble for that. And then John Paul Getty, a tragic story. Of course, at first he was really happy, but later in his 20s, he got into drinking and a lot of drugs and stuff. And at 24, he overdosed and had a stroke and ended up in a wheelchair, kind of like a paraplegic almost. And he recovered a bit later in life, but died younger. Like, I think he was about 54 when he died. And so a really tragic story for him. And it was also tough because his great-grandfather never left money for him. And I don't know how much his dad had given him, but it wasn't like easy. Like, he had to go through life like pretty broke. So pretty tragic story there. So the Lindbergh case is one of the most famous in all of American history. So this baby's father was Charles Lindbergh, who was a famous aviator. He was the first person to fly across the Atlantic solo the whole way. So that was a huge thing that he did in 1927. They had a huge house in Hopewell, New Jersey, and it was actually still under renovation. So they weren't even living there full time. They were just occasionally staying there. And of course, they were wealthy, so they had a nurse, a butler, and a maid. And their immediate family knew like their whereabouts and where the baby would have been. But no one else. So that's also another strange thing about this story, because like who would have known like the baby would have even been there on that day, because they usually didn't even stay there. But on the evening of March 1st, 1932, someone brought a ladder and climbed up to the second floor and took the baby, who was just 20 months old at that time. And so I'm not sure if it was the nurse or someone had come in shortly after around 9 o'clock or something and seen the baby was gone. And there was a ransom note asking for $50,000. And so the father, Lindbergh, actually was pretty much leading the investigation. He didn't even want that much help from the FBI initially. And this story at the time, which I didn't realize till I kind of investigated it, was like the JonBenet case. I mean, it was really unusual that someone would have known the baby was there. There was a lot of unusual things with the crime. A lot of people thought that it was possibly the father that had staged this and had someone do it, because maybe the baby was like kind of inferior because he had a lot of medical problems and things. And so there's a lot of controversy about that in general, but I won't go into all those details because it would take forever. So within a few weeks, on April 2nd, they were able to deliver that money via like a random cab driver that sent it to someone. And it was like $50,000. Some of it was cash, some of it was gold certificates. And the guy had gotten the money and gotten away, but they never did get the kid. And then about 5 weeks later, on May 12th, A truck driver had stopped to take a leak on the side of the road and found a dead baby there. And they had found that someone had crashed the baby's skull in and had been killed basically probably several weeks before. So it would probably be before that guy even got the money. And so over the next year, there were basically no leads. But the government basically said that for all people who had gold certificates at that time, you needed to return them by a certain date or you'd lose the gold that you could have gotten. And so at that time, someone had returned those certificates, and they were the notes they had given the kidnapper. And so that kind of began a process where people had some evidence, and then over the next few months or year, they had seen that this money was getting spent all around New York City. And so finally, on September 18th, 1934, this German guy named Richard Hauptmann was arrested, and he was later found guilty. Now, I won't go into all the details of that case, but they had found like part of a ladder in his attic, and they obviously found money in his home, and a lot of other things that made it look like he was guilty. But there was a lot of other reasons why I said like it could have been someone else. And Richard Hauptmann, as you can imagine, got the death penalty at 36 years old. So I'll go into the next case of Peter Weinberger. This was only a 1-month-old infant that was kidnapped from his porch on July 4th, 1956, on Long Island, New York. So his mother had just put him out on the porch for just 10 minutes. She went inside and she came out and the kid was gone. And there was a note that said, "Don't call the police or the FBI. I just want $2,000. So it wasn't even really that much money. But this case was a big deal because up to this point, usually it was wealthy people's kids who had been kidnapped. And this was a pretty middle-class family, so it was quite unusual. So as in almost all of these cases, they did contact the police that day. The police had even mentioned to the press, "Don't say anything." And every single time someone releases some news like that night or that day. So they did have the $2,000 to give him the next morning, but he got spooked because there was a lot of reporters around, there's police around. They tried a couple more times to make different pickups, and the kidnapper got spooked. So they didn't hear anything back, and within 6 weeks or so, the FBI was like in full throttle trying to find out who did this. And of course they had the ransom note, which, you have the handwriting you could look through. And they had about 250 people that went through 2 million public records, going through like the DMV or arrest records or, anything you could find at a bank. And they were able to actually find this guy who had gotten busted for bootlegging before. And his name was Angelo LaMarca. He was a guy who was in his early 30s and already had a family, and he just overspent his money and he needed some. He didn't think the police and everyone would get involved. And the sad part is in this case too is that he didn't even keep the baby alive for a long time. He got spooked within 24 hours and he basically just left the baby on the side of the road. And they eventually found the baby, and they'd seen the baby possibly live for about a week, probably just out there screaming in a forest. What a tragic story. And he ended up getting the death penalty within a year or two. And ironically, Angelo LaMarca's son, who was I think about 7 years old or something at the time, he grew up to be a police officer to kind of redeem the family name and do something positive in that direction. But the son was in Long Beach and ended up getting indicted for murder. And so people were thinking like, this is like a genetic thing because the grandson ended up a murderer as well. So the next case is of Adolph Coors III. So his grandfather in the 1870s had come out to Colorado and founded the Coors Beer Brewery and Factory, which is the largest one in the entire world. And so huge family out here with a ton of money. And on February 9th, 1960, his grandson, who was like a middle-aged guy at this time, he was going out to work, which the factory's in Golden, and so he was going through Morrison, and his car was left on the bridge, but he wasn't there. And so like a milk truck driver pulled up, and he sees like this truck in the middle of the bridge, and he's beeping, and he walks around, and he's like, "There's no one here, the music's on, the car's on." and he moved the car, and then he saw some blood in the road. And so later, everyone found out that he didn't make it to work and that he had been kidnapped. And the next day, they got a typed letter in the mail, and the kidnapper asked for $500,000, and it gave instructions, like usual, don't call the FBI or the police, and you'll get him back safely as long as I get this money. And so, of course, they had seen at the scene that there was some blood on the ground, and I think his glasses were left there, but he possibly could be alive. And so they did get some of the money together, because $500,000 is not too much for them. But in that letter, they said there would be more instructions to come, but there weren't any instructions. And so there was no leads, and no one heard anything about this. But about 6 months later in September, some hikers were out kind of north of Pikes Peak, out in the woods somewhere, and they found like some clothes and a skull and then the other skeletal remains. And they had seen a shirt, and in the back of the shirt there was like blood, and he was obviously shot in the back. So it's presumed that the guy came with the gun and he ran and he shot him in the back. So who knows when he actually died? It could have been right there or later on, but he obviously had died at some point. And so there was no leads with that case for a while, but some people had some info, like some people had seen that car around, and they had probably figured his dad had bought like some of the things, either the typewriter or that car. And so they were looking for his son, Joseph Corbett Jr., and he had been convicted of murder in California a few years before that and had escaped prison. So he was definitely like a high probability suspect. And so there were all these alerts across the nation, because this was a huge international case. And a few people in Canada thought they had seen someone like him. And then finally in Vancouver, the police caught him there. And he said, "Oh, you got me." And he gave up. And he actually ended up getting convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And so he was released on parole in 1980. So he actually only ended up doing like 19 years, and he got out for good behavior. So that was kind of a surprise. And he ended up driving a truck for the Salvation Army the rest of his life until he retired. And then he committed suicide at the age of 80 in August 2009. So pretty crazy story there. And then, of course, the next case and the last one I'll mention is JonBenet Ramsey, who most people assume the family had did this. But I figured I'd mention it here because there's a possibility that it was an intruder. And just to briefly go through this case, they have a regular Christmas morning. They open their gifts, and you've got the two parents and the son and the daughter. And later they go out to dinner at a friend's house. And then they come home at about 9:30 or so, and they're in bed by 10:30 on Christmas evening. So nothing unusual there. Now, the next morning, they were going to fly out at 7:30, so they had to get up early. And the mother walked downstairs at about 5:55 a.m., and she saw a 2.5-page ransom note that said, "We have your daughter, we want $118,000, etc." Really long letter, which is strange. So she panics, she runs upstairs, tell her husband, she checks and sees that her daughter's gone. The police come 6 minutes later, and they briefly search through the house, but they didn't find anything. Now, they're not really looking that hard for the girl because they think she's kidnapped and they're out of the house anyway. And so they leave one detective there throughout the day, and the parents invite a few friends over. And so in between 8 or 10 o'clock, the kidnappers were supposed to call and tell them the further instructions to give them the money. And nothing really happens, and they're just waiting and waiting. So around 1 o'clock, the one detective says to the father, John, "Why don't you and your friend look around the house again and make sure, we don't find anything or whatever." He goes into the basement again, looks a little bit more, and he goes into this back room, like this wine cellar, and he finds that his daughter's there. And he brings her upstairs, and she's already been dead for a long time. So this is a really unusual situation, because who would leave the body there if you wanted to get the money? Why didn't you bring her out? And then other people are thinking, well, the parents did it and they staged it. So anyway, there's a lot of other things with this case. It's really strange, kind of like the Lindbergh case, where it's really difficult to tell what happened because the police investigation is botched and the evidence is tampered with. And so we're not sure what happened. And that's also why I'm looking at this kidnapping idea, because by looking at other cases, maybe we could learn more. So anyway, now let's look at some of the movies that came out that were pretty famous about kidnapping. So in the ransom note that they wrote concerning JonBenet Ramsey, most of this 2.5 pages is references either to movies around that time or older movies, or it could even be previous ransom notes that I even just talked about. So some of these older movies probably didn't have a lot of relevance on the actual possible kidnapping, but they could have used phrases from those movies in their own ransom note that they would have written. But in Dirty Harry, which came out in 1971, the bad guy in the movie ends up hijacking a bus at the end of the film. And I think that's important because, not for the JonBenet case, but in the Chowchilla kidnapping, they obviously hijacked a bus, and that happened only 5 years after that movie came out. And those guys would have been like in high school or 19 years old. So that probably had a big influence on, the idea they had for that bus kidnapping. So fast forward to Speed, which came out in 1995, which was a year before JonBenet Ramsey was killed. And the movie itself isn't probably real significant for like the kidnappers' plans necessarily, but there's a reference in that movie where Dennis Hopper says, "Don't try to grow a brain, John." And that definitely is nothing I've heard in any other movie, and that's written in the ransom note. By the way, if you're curious more about the contents of the ransom note, I'll put a link below for that so you can read through the whole thing. And I also have a long video I did on JonBenet Ramsey, and I talk about the subject a little more. And so the last movie I'll talk about is Ransom with Mel Gibson. This movie was super important because this was still in movie theaters in Boulder when JonBenet Ramsey was killed. And so in this movie, Mel Gibson, who's the main actor, is a billionaire. I think he's the president of like an airline. And they're at like a science fair in a park, and he loses sight of his son for a few minutes, and the kidnappers take his son. Now, you don't actually see them take the son. And later in a clip, Mel Gibson's looking around, there's the white van that his son in, and you don't hear any noise or anything. So there's no sign of any struggle, and there's no one that had seen anything, basically. So there's a few kidnappers. One of the women was actually the caterer at Mel Gibson's place, basically, in this movie. And so she's one of the people who's out to get him. And then there's these 3 other guys. I don't know exactly how they're related or their frustrations, other than, I guess they're just the working lower class. But the main guy, who's the boyfriend of the caterer, is Gary Sinise. And he's a cop, just like in Speed. And at this point, he's not a retired cop. Like, he's literally a cop at that time. And so anyway, I'm not going to go into the actual names of the characters. I'm just going to say the actor's name because it's easier that way. And so they ask for $2 million for Mel Gibson, basically. And he agrees to do it. And when he goes to meet the guy isn't telling him where his son's located. And so Mel Gibson's like, well, I don't want to give you the money, and there's a little bit of a tussle. The FBI ends up shooting the kidnapper, and he dies before he tells Mel Gibson where his boy's located. And so Mel Gibson's about to meet him again to give the money, but he's having second thoughts because he's like, maybe they're going to kill my son anyway. Why didn't that guy tell me where the kid's located? And this is actually the truth. The kidnappers never intend to give the boy back. They're going to kill him regardless. Now, Mel Gibson and no one else in the movie knows that, but that's the plan. Another interesting thing about this movie that's really important is that, as I mentioned, there was no struggle at the beginning that you saw. When they bring this kid back to the house, there's no struggle at any point in this movie. Does this kid try to yell, try to escape, try to scream, try to fight? Anything. He's just the most docile kidnapped victim in the world, like a dream for any kidnapper, basically. And actually, even in the movie, they kind of befriend him because he's so polite and nice. And so they even have to tell each other, like, oh, don't talk to the kid or try to befriend him. Technically they're going to eventually kill him. And so the father knows they're probably going to kill him anyway. And he's like, why don't I turn this around? He's about to do the exchange to give him the money and get back his son. And then he goes on live TV on the last minute and says, you know what? I'm not going to give him the $2 million. I'm putting a $2 million bounty on the kidnappers. I don't care if they're dead or alive. You get $2 million. And so this totally changes everyone's plans. Now the kidnappers are on the defense. And of course his wife freaks out and the police and the FBI freak out. They're like, this is a bad idea. You've got billions of dollars. Just give him the $2 million so you can get your kid back. He thinks about it for a while and then he doubles down. He says $4 million. And so now all the kidnappers are kind of freaking out. They're like, maybe I should just try to leave and not be a part of this. And so the cop sees two of the guys in the van about to take off, probably either to flee or maybe even turn in the other kidnappers. And there's a shootout. He kills those guys. And then he ends up killing his girlfriend, basically. So now that the three perpetrators are dead, he's the only one alive, and he's a cop. And so all the other police and people show up, and this cop is actually now the savior, and he could get the $4 million because he saved the boy. Now, of course, we all know that's not true. And so he's in a hurry to get that money because he knows that his son, he's going to be able to identify that this cop that everyone loves is actually the guy that kidnapped him. And so Mel Gibson's writing the check, and then his son happens to stumble in and sees the cop who had kidnapped him. And the cop didn't see the boy, but Mel Gibson looked over and saw, like, he wet his pants, and he's like, yeah, there's something wrong here. And so he ended up not giving him the check, and there's this big thing, and as you can imagine, the cop ends up getting killed, and it's a happy story. The family's reunited, etc. So now that we've gone over 8 different crazy kidnappings and a few of those movies that came out at that time, let's give an analysis of some things we could learn from this. Because we would assume that if it was a kidnapper in the JonBenet Ramsey case, they would have either seen some of these movies or known of some of these cases in history. So the first thing that I think we all could learn is that almost all of these kidnappings in history are all botched kidnappings. So a lot of people look at the JonBenet thing and they're like, wow, the kid's dead in the basement. What kidnapper would do that? How could anything go wrong? It always goes wrong. I mean, all of these cases were a disaster pretty much. Adolph Coors was killed probably right away. You know, the guy had hoped that he was going to probably go in the car with him and he would take him to a safe house. The guy ran, he shot him in the back, and he was probably dead either there or within a few hours. Peter Weinberger was left for dead within 24 hours. Now, he might have technically been alive for a week in a bush somewhere, but he was definitely left for dead right away. Charlie Ross was never found. We have no idea if he lived a week, 3 months, 5 months, or, you know, technically he could have grown up in another town in America. There was even some people that said they were in decades later, but DNA proved that wasn't true. Paul Getty was eventually freed after about 6 months, but he lost his ear, later got involved with drugs and alcohol, ended up in a wheelchair and died young. So, I mean, that case is super tragic. In the Lindbergh case, they gave the money to the kidnapper, but the Lindbergh baby was still whacked in the head and killed. And so they never got the baby back in that case. The kids in the Chowchilla case were super lucky. I mean, all 26 of them and the bus driver got out. They could have easily died in there. I mean, those guys were not even at the location when they escaped. And that was mid-July. With that California sun beating on there all day, and with no oxygen or very limited oxygen, they could have all died if they had not escaped. The only lucky one out of the 8 cases I talked about was Frank Sinatra Jr. He's the only one that made it out. Obviously, JonBenet didn't either, so 7 out of 8 cases there were all really tragic. So let's look at the perpetrators and kind of their background. In many of these cases, they're young guys in their early 20s. And if they're not in a group of guys in their early 20s, they're a guy in their 30s or middle-aged solo guys doing this. Or in the one case with Charlie Ross, there were 2 guys who I assume were like middle-aged. But you could pretty much see a lot of these times, a few young guys get together to do this, or this individual around 30s or 40s. Another thing we learned from this is that the kidnappers in real life, or even in the movies, even in Ransom, it was only $2 million. But in most of these cases, the kidnappers don't ask for that much money. Now with the Chowchilla case, it was $5 million, which is a good amount of money, but if it's 26 kids, that could be 26 families. That's actually not a ton of money. Frank Sinatra Jr. was only $240,000. Charlie Ross was $20,000, which at that time in the 1800s was probably about $450,000, but still not a ridiculous amount. Peter Weinberger was only $2,000, which definitely isn't a lot of money. With the Lindbergh case, it was only $50,000. Paul Getty was a good amount at $17 million, but that's also not a ton for like one of the richest people in the world. And they later lowered that down to $3.2 million. So that's not a lot by any standards for one of the richest people in the world. With Adolph Coors III, it was $500,000. That's not a lot of money for one of the richest families in the USA or even in the world. And if JonBenet Ramsey's case was a kidnapping, it was $118,000, which also isn't a lot. So of course, $118,000 is one of the strangest things about the JonBenet Ramsey case. And while most of these numbers are even, like people wanted $50,000 or $20,000 or $500,000, a couple things were kind of weird. Like the mafia in Italy originally wanted $17 million. Why not $20 million? And then they lowered it down to $3.2 million. Why not just $3 million or $3.5? So that's a little weird. And then with Frank Sinatra Jr., they asked for $240,000. Why not $250,000? Or why not $500,000? Or even $1 million? So one of the reasons why you might have weird numbers is because in a group, everyone gets paid differently depending on what they do. So maybe, let's say in the JonBenet Ramsey case, you have two main guys doing the actual kidnapping. Maybe they get $50,000 each. And then maybe you have two lookouts who aren't really doing much. They get $9,000 each, and that's where you could get $118,000. And you also don't want to put much money in the bank, because the bank notifies the federal government if you have over $10,000 put into the bank. And so that also goes with any time you make 10 grand. You have to report that to the government. So you could put like 9 grand in the bank or whatever, but you're not going to put a bunch of money in the bank unless you want a red flag. And so you have to hoard that money like in your home somewhere or whatever. And they also chose $118,000 possibly because the father got a bonus that was $118,000 earlier that year, and on every pay stub it said that. And they had paperwork all around the house. And so if the perpetrators got into the house while they were at dinner, they would have looked through some paperwork and they would have said, "What should we ask for? $1 million? $500,000? $200,000? And they're like, let's just ask for his bonus. It's not that much money. Let's address the letter to just him, Mr. Ramsey, and let's say, it's just up to you. It's not that much money, John. Just don't call the police. Don't call the FBI. You'll get your daughter back in the morning. We just want that $118,000. And unfortunately, the kid was probably freaking out and they hit her over the head or whatever. And so the movie Ransom, I think, had a big influence on the perpetrators. If they had just watched that movie before they did the kidnapping, as I mentioned, they would have seen the most docile kid in the world. Like he just laid in the bed. He never tried to escape. He never yelled. And so they probably assumed JonBenet was going to be kind of like this boy. And the fact that she's a female might give you the impression it might be even easier. They were just going to slowly take her. She wasn't going to resist. And obviously that probably wasn't the case. And so I think, they went up to her room and they might have even been able to initially talk to her to come downstairs. And we're going to try to talk to her to get her to go out willingly. And she might have had some resistance, but not bad. She's 6 years old. Like, if they had masks on, that would make her terrified. And any kid going into a basement is scary anyway. So if there's people with masks bringing you down, at some point she probably freaked out. Now, there was a couple black marks in her back, which possibly could have been a taser. They might have thought they could have knocked her out, but that doesn't knock you out. That's just like, I don't know, thousands or tens of thousands of volts of electricity. And at that point, she completely had a meltdown, and they couldn't get her to to stop. And at one point, even neighbor heard a loud scream, and then it just abruptly stopped. And they probably hit her in the head with a flashlight or a bat or something. And then they were like, shit, we did leave the ransom note. We hoped to get her out, but it didn't work. The neighbor also mentioned they heard a metal grate. They probably got out from the basement window, which is where they probably came in, and they just left the scene. And of course, they never called because they knew the kid was dead. It was kind of like the Coors story with Adolph Coors. You know, he had planned to do this big thing, didn't intend on killing him, and so there's no point in calling. So the last thing that's kind of interesting is that in Speed and Ransom, the main perpetrator is a police officer or an ex-cop. And actually, in the first case in history with Charlie Ross, there was a potential ex-cop involved. So that's kind of interesting because that's, of course, the last person you would assume would do something like that is a police officer. But as we all know in history, cops could be just as guilty as anyone else is some crazy crime. And is there a possibility that in the JonBenet Ramsey case, one of the cops in the Boulder Police Department or somewhere else could have did this? I think absolutely. I think some of these two movies, Speed and Ransom, they could have identified with those police officers. Another interesting point is that there was only one or two footprints that they were able to like photograph or make any significance of. And there was one next to her body that was of a high-tech brand boot. And you know who uses those kinds of boots? Cops. And so most of us assume that it was just cops who were investigating, but that might have been from the evening before. And I didn't mention about Ransom, but the motivation in Ransom wasn't just money. It was political in class lines. The cop mentions to Mel Gibson in the movie that, you know, we're the poor underclass, and you're like the above class. He refers to, actually, an old book, The Time Machine. And so his whole point is like, you're at the upper class, you can do whatever you want, and you're an untouchable, but we're down here in the streets doing all the crap work and working for nothing. And so I think these cops in these police department could be looking at this. They see this guy, like JonBenet Ramsey's dad, who had $1 billion in sales at his company in Boulder that year. He sold like computer components for Lockheed Martin. And so he's a super wealthy guy in a house that's 3 times bigger than everyone else. And his kid's in these crazy pageants, and she's going to grow up to be like Miss America. And they're probably very jealous that his bonus is more than a police officer makes in 2 or 3 years. And so I could see a police officer being super jealous, or any other person. And so that $118,000 is kind of like a poke in the eye to the average person. So the police department in Boulder was against the family 100% from the very beginning. And they had good reasons to. Anytime a child's found in a home, the parents could definitely be responsible. So it's not very unusual, but they really didn't ask too many people around or do a full investigation. They pointed at the parents right away. So maybe they should consider looking at some of the handwriting from some of the police officers who were in that department. And maybe someone like Steve Thomas has some similar writing. Who knows? I doubt it was him, but I don't know. It could be someone out there or someone else, but that's just something to consider. One other interesting point is that in the Weinberger case, they had like 250 feds go through 2 million documents at that time to find out who the ransom note was from. And that was like in the 50s. In Boulder, Colorado, you have the University of Colorado. You've got 40% of the population are students with tons of writing samples and admission letters and other things. So you could have had the feds go through all of that paperwork of the students, because as I mentioned, we know that it could be a young group of students. We had just seen this Kohlberger in Idaho that killed those 2 or 3 girls and that guy. That was a huge case. Ted Bundy, there's many students that could have did that. You could look through all of the records like they did in that Weinberger case, and I think if they had did that, there's a possibility that it might not even been a student, but you might have been able to find who wrote this super long 2.5-page note. But they only focus on the family, and it's true. The mother, Patsy, does have a lot of similarities, and she has some odd behavior, and there's some weird things about that case. So I'm not saying it's an intruder. I think it definitely could still be the family. But I think it would be good for them to go through those papers, which are probably still at the university in Boulder. There's probably many documents in that town they can check. So anyway, I hope you guys learned something from this video. I had fun researching this and learned a lot too. If you liked the video, subscribe and like it. And I'll do some more things on the JonBenet Ramsey case, not every week. In the next few months, I'll do like 1 or 2 videos. I think the next thing I'll look at is the Suzanne Morthew's case. There's a woman who disappeared and was later found dead, and they assume her husband had did it. I think a very good case there. And also look at the Chris Watts case, because those are both in Colorado where I'm at. And I'll have plenty of other cool videos. So anyway, guys, take care, have an open mind, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.